Hi everyone, my name is JP and this is the Radical Adventist Project. This is part one of what will most likely be a three-part series. And we're going to be looking at the distinct roles, theological roles of pastors. For those who are new, and most of you are at this stage, I have been getting distracted by what I perceive to be significant problems and conflicts of interest in how church is operating, how the Seventh-day Adventist Church specifically is operating, and also the fundamental problem with overworking of pastors. Oftentimes we find our pastors so bogged down with administration and meetings that their ability to be spiritual counselors and guides is greatly diminished. This is sometimes self-inflicted with this new tendency for pastors to somehow promote overwork. I just recently saw a video where a pastor was talking about an apostle and I am a pastor and a YouTube content creator and a marketer and this and that and this and the other. Those are not anyway, as I will argue, necessary or even practical for what a pastor is intended to do. In this part, what we're going to look at very briefly is this biblical separation or the qualifications for each of these offices. And specifically, we're going to highlight the role of the 12, the apostles, the role of the deacons, and then the eventual role of the elders, and then go from there. In part two, we will look more closely at the role of spiritual gifts and the problem of stacking, and whether or not this is a biblical or theologically consistent idea. And then in part three, I'm going to try to offer some practical, theological, and policy adjustments. You see, our church manual is designed to be practical, and oftentimes being practical misses the theological foundation. It just so happens that as Adventists, we have a very weak theological foundation as far as ordination and administration of the gifts. And so I hope this may be a positive contribution to the larger conversation as far as ordination is concerned. You may also find that two of my past videos are directly relevant and maybe even worth watching. And in fact, it would be great if you did watch. The first one I did was church versus business. And this series will continue to pick apart that tendency to view church as a business. We're not CEOs as pastors. We are ministers. We're here to do something very specific. That is to improve prayer and to approve the gospel. We're supposed to give the words of life and to give you tools to pray, which is the fundamental purpose of this channel. With the housekeeping now in order, let us turn now to Acts chapter 6, where we see a very clear delineation between the role of the apostles, we see the reference to disciples, and we see an introduction to deacons. All right, now in Acts chapter 6, we see a problem. We see two communities merging into one, the Hellenistic community and the Hebrew community, as it's described in Acts chapter 6. Their wives are not getting food distributions equally. The majority Jewish community is getting access to food in a more consistent way than the minority community, which would be the Hebrew or Greek or Greco-Roman community in Palestine. To solve this problem, the apostles call the disciples from the community. Now, in verse 2, it's very, very unclear what we're meaning here. And the 12 called together the whole community of the disciples. Does this mean that the thousands of believers that Luke describes came there to a big meeting? Or are we likely seeing delegates? I think it's the latter, although everyone is made disciples. Matthew 28 points to making disciples. A follower of Jesus is essentially a disciple of Jesus. And so it's an interesting conundrum here. But I would like to suggest that these are delegates. These are leading figures, representatives of the various communities of Jesus followers all around the area. So the solution is we need to appoint some deacons. These deacons, the word refers to waiting upon, ministers. They're those who are servants, who minister to. And these deacons are going to fix the problem of food distribution. Now, here is where we normally just stop. A group of 7 deacons were appointed by the apostles in order to facilitate food distribution. That means the practical operation of the community. All right? The problem is that the deacons have a larger role. We see them actively casting out demons, healing people, preaching. Stephen preaches for an entire chapter in Acts chapter 7. Philip goes into Samaria and does a mighty work, and he prepares the gospel field for Peter, who would later come and deal with the challenges there. And so the administration function of the deacon carries with it gospel initiatives. In principle, we would be more closely ascribing this to internships for apostle ministry, as it were. They're doing essentially the functions of the 12 when Jesus sent them out 2 by 2. They would go door to door and they would prepare the way for Jesus to come in and administer healing and other gifts and functions of Jesus' ministry in these communities. Or the sending out of the 70. It's more aligned to that. And from those, they became the leading figures of the early Jesus movement. And so look at this more of like an internship for pastors, an internship for leadership ministry, for pastoral ministry. I would also be remiss not to point out very clearly what the role of the apostles as they understood it to be. In Acts 6, verse 4, the 12 say that these tasks need to be delegated to administrators, the deacons, so that they may spend their time in prayer and in serving the word. That is, bringing and distilling the words of Jesus to the community and the teachings of Jesus. You see, in this early Jesus movement, the effort was not to increase administration of the pastors, or is it the pastors? We'll get there. You see, in the early Jesus movement, the role or the goal and intention of the apostles was to delegate responsibilities, not take on more functions. They wanted to distill the general day-to-day operations, it seems, to others so that they could focus primarily on formation, on how to strengthen the spiritual layout of this Jesus movement. The deacons, although set and appointed to fix this problem of distribution, also seem to carry strong pastoral, what we would consider pastoral duties, in that they were preaching, they were teaching, they were casting out demons, and they were preparing the ground for the apostles. This is a similar path that the disciples themselves took under Jesus. When we fast forward a few decades and we look at 1 Timothy chapter 3, we see that this role of the deacons has nothing to do with administration of operational administration. Let's look. Deacons, in verse 8 of chapter 3. Deacons, likewise, must be serious, not double-tongued, not indulging in much wine, not greedy for money. They must hold fast to the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, and let them first be tested. Then if they prove themselves blameless, let them serve as deacons. Women likewise must be serious, not slanderers, but temperate, faithful in all things. Let deacons be married only once, and let them manage their children and their households well. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves and great boldness in the faith that is in Messiah Jesus. So apparently, the role of the deacons emphasized more the ground building, the faith building, the virtue building aspect of ministry, and not so much the custodial, the management of resources. For any who are experienced as deacons or have been ordained, the role of the deacon was operational, custodial. And in many churches, the deacons replace the function of a custodian. They essentially help the church save money from what normally would go to a company that would clean or fix or maintain the property. And oftentimes, the spiritual situation of a deacon is very limited, or the expectations of spiritual attainment is very limited. That's a problem, I think. Or at least it's inconsistent with what we see in Scripture, where we see a deacon, his main focus is actually formational, in building up and preparing the ground for the 12, for the apostles, for the people who are meant to, who have this deep connection in prayer and in sharing the teachings of Jesus. Now let's stay here for a second in 1 Timothy 3 and look at the role of the elder. They must be above reproach, married only once, temperate, sensible, respectable, hospitable, an apt teacher, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, and not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, keeping his children submissive and respectful in every way. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may be puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that they may not fall into disgrace and the snare of the devil. So this leading man, and I say this is perhaps a time for an important footnote. I actually have written a paper that's in the works. I don't know where I'll end up publishing it, on 1 Timothy and the context of the paterfamilias in this passage. It's important to understand this contextual setting, because we oftentimes just take this moment where we see the masculine, we see man, and therefore suggest that elders must always be men. But the principle is householder. The leading householder is responsible for managing their home well. And it is suggested that the leading householder will be respected in their community. They are advanced in the faith. They have understanding. They have virtues, all the virtues. They manage their household well. They're respected in the community. And they have a high faith and regard for the message, for the gospel. Okay? Those are the parameters. So if we are to apply a householder context and we move that into today, then this idea of male-only eldership or leadership just crumbles. It is administers those who have consistency in their household and in their community, and who have the grace-filled knowledge of Jesus and able to teach. Those are people who should be ascribed elders, given the position of elders. But notice here that the role of the elder is quite practically administrative. The elders are effectively the leaders on the ground. They are the ones who make sure everything is operating and functioning normally. They are the administrators. And so we should rightfully consider our elders administrators. They're administrators of their own homes, they're respected in their communities, and they have a high connection and faith regard for the gospel. And this allows them to have the purview, the wherewithal to manage the issues of the faith community, of the church. Again, this is a different function than the apostles, than the 12 who were given the purview of, or who are trying to focus on prayer and the serving of the word. This leads to an important realization. In many ways, the role of the pastor conflates all three of these positions. The pastor is expected to be able to focus on prayer and the ministration of the word. They're also supposed to be respected members of the community and able to administer and do administration. And they're also expected to be filled with the mysteries of faith and prepare the ground for others. So they have evangelistic, they have administrative, and then they have spiritual responsibilities. We have essentially designed the pastoral ministry to be all three in one. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the most practical way to think about this. Why is it that we do not confer more capacity for administration in our elders, in our local elders? Why is it that we do not expect more spiritual formation, Bible work, evangelistic leading, Bible studies from our deacons? Why is it that we're not letting the operational day-to-day going to hired staff and officials rather than deacons and volunteers? All of this stems from this assumption that the pastor is able to do a bunch of this stuff, or at least able to set it all up to function. And practically what happens is pastors are not always very good at this. And so management falls by the wayside, and so deacons pick up the slack. Administration falls by the wayside, so the elders pick up the slack. And then the pastors are still thinking they can do these things, and so they tell these groups what to do, and they micromanage, rather than following the guidance of the apostles, which are pretty solid guidance, and removing these responsibilities from their purview so that they can focus explicitly on prayer, developing spiritual life of the community and themselves, and the sharing of the teachings of Jesus. Those are the primary functions of our pastoral calling, I suggest. I think it's pretty helpful to consider ourselves apostles in this way, that we are there to bring fruit, to harvest. We're not here to wait upon tables. We're not here to be necessarily administrators. Although I consider myself a pretty solid manager. But I think we need to start thinking about, if I'm going to manage, should I be a pastor? And if I'm going to be a pastor, should I be managing? We'll leave it to part 2 as we look at spiritual gifts. Until then, blessings.